All this, see this is all variables. It's random, it's chaotic. Every equation needs stability, something known. It's called a constant. Desmond, you have no constant.
Forrest talked often about the clues in the poem and the hints in the books, but Forrest provided a third type of information that exists somewhere between a clue and a hint. For my search, I classified Forrest's words into 3 categories: clues, hints, and constants. This video is about the constants, but I will be talking somewhat about clues and hints as well. In a couple minutes, I'll give definitions for each of these 3 words. The key thing to remember here is that the specific definitions that I assigned to these words are not as important as the act of assigning definitions. Occasionally, you might run into a chase-related argument revolving around whether some statement by Forrest is a clue or a hint. Any discussion of whether one of Forrest's statements is a clue or a hint is meaningless without precise definitions for those words. And if the definitions are clear enough, the argument settles itself. That was my goal. Words themselves are meaningless. Words are just noises coming out of people's mouths. The definitions attached to those noises are the only things that matter. The precise definition of words is a necessity of communication, but every word has multiple definitions. When using a word, if I have one definition in mind and you have another definition in mind, then what I've said is not what you've heard. If we want to understand one another, we must use the same definitions of our words. All of this may seem self-evident, but I found it helpful to be meticulous about the differences between a clue, a constant, and a hint, and to be uncompromising about my use of those words, even though I was only talking to myself. What follows are merely my definitions for these words, nothing more. For the most part, Forrest used those same definitions for clues and hints, but not always. When Forrest strays from a strict definition of those words, I chalk it up to the words clue and hint being common terms that predated the chase. Those words are easily misused in a casual setting. This is similar to the term buried treasure. It's difficult not to refer to the treasure as buried. That phrase was burned into our minds from a young age, and it's not really surprising that it surfaces occasionally. Forrest's occasional inconsistencies with how he used these words were, to me, nothing more than honest mistakes that held no meaning. So then, how do I define these words? The first category is the clues. All of the clues are contained within the 24 lines of the poem. Anything outside the poem is not a clue. There are 9 clues total. Each of the 9 clues refers to a specific geographic location, a place where you could put a pin on a map. The clues are consecutive, contiguous, and chronological. The first clue is, begin it where warm waters halt. The second category is the constants. Constants are statements of fact made by Forrest. Unlike the hints, constants resist misinterpretation. If I could come up with multiple reasonable interpretations for one of Forrest's statements, then I classified that statement as a potential hint, not as a constant. Example constants include the chest is located above 5,000 feet and the chest is located below 10,200 feet. While it is possible to come up with multiple interpretations of those statements, I have not been able to come up with multiple reasonable interpretations of those statements. My criteria for what qualified as a reasonable interpretation of a constant was much higher than what I considered reasonable for the hints. The third category is the hints. Anything said by Forrest that was not a clue and not a constant had the potential to be a hint. Constants stand apart from the clues and the hints. For each line of the poem, for each clue, and for each hint, there may be multiple reasonable interpretations. Which interpretation to use for each clue and hint may vary with the solution. And except for the first clue, it is unclear which lines in the poem are clues. The same thing applies to the hints. It is unclear whether any given statement by Forrest contains a hint or not. The clues and the hints have to be searched for. They have to be found. None of that applies to the constants. I didn't have to search for constants. I didn't have to analyze or interpret constants. Constants were matter-of-fact statements made by Forrest with a clear meaning, and their interpretation remained the same from solution to solution. Constants are constant. The correct interpretations for clues and hints cannot be known for certain until the poem's legitimate solution is revealed. Until then, it's all just speculation. The correct interpretations for constants were known in advance of having a completed solution. In fact, the correct interpretations for constants were known in advance of even starting the game. Here are some of Forrest's statements that made it onto my list of constants. There are 9 clues in the poem. The first clue is, "Begin it where warm waters halt." Searchers can find the treasure's hiding location with just the poem and a map. The treasure was located above 5,000 feet. The treasure was located below 10,200 feet. The treasure was not in a mine or a tunnel. The treasure was not in a graveyard or an outhouse. The treasure was not in Utah, Idaho, or Canada. The treasure was not underwater. The treasure was located in the Rocky Mountains. The treasure was located at least 8.25 miles north of Santa Fe. The treasure was located in an isolated area. The treasure was located in a place where people would not normally go. If Yellowstone erupts, the treasure will not be blown to bits. Children may have an advantage. This is only a partial list. There are a lot more constants. Constants can be derived as well. For example, Forrest said on multiple occasions that searchers were continuing to find the first 2 clues. I don't know if Forrest intended for those statements to help searchers, but they did. I created a constant out of those statements that said that the first 2 clues must be obvious. Any solution I came up with had to adhere to that new constant. If my first 2 clues were not obvious, my solution was probably wrong. I gave my list of constants a higher status than hints. I didn't feel the need to explain any specific hint or aberration. I did feel the need to explain every item on my list of constants. Each potential solution I came up with would have to adhere to every item on that list. For example, how would a child have an advantage with my solution? I had to have a good answer for that question. A good answer. Another example was with Yellowstone. Forrest was emphatic with his statement that an eruption under Yellowstone Lake would not blow the treasure chest to bits, no matter the odds. If my solution led to anywhere near Yellowstone Lake, I needed to come up with a good reason to discount Forrest's statement. A really good reason. I didn't have a set passing grade in mind when testing my solution against my list of constants. But if a single constant was not satisfied, it would have caused me to seriously question that solution. I doubt I would have made a boots-on-the-ground trip to test such a solution without a solid explanation for any discrepancy. Constants were resistant to misinterpretation. In practice, this meant that I classified any of Forrest's statements that could be reasonably explained by more than one interpretation as a potential hint and not as a constant. Constants were also subject to a much higher standard than hints. Since I required the solution to adhere to the constants, I required absolute confidence in my interpretation of those constants. Some of this confidence had to do with where the constant came from, which I'll get into in another video. In any case, I always erred on the side of caution when adding a new item to my list of constants. For example, one of my constants is that the treasure was located somewhere in the mountains north of Santa Fe. This passed my good enough to be a constant test for 4 reasons. First, Forrest stated this from day one. Second, that statement is in The Thrill of the Chase. Third, Forrest has repeated it on numerous occasions. And fourth, the statement is highly resistant to misinterpretation. However, just because I believe a statement is resistant to misinterpretation does not mean that others won't misinterpret it. There are some who question the exact meaning of the phrase north of Santa Fe. Some think it means that Forrest was indicating a direction very near 360 degrees due north of Santa Fe, but Forrest never said that. To support the 360-degree theory, some searchers use a post on DaleNeitzel.com from October 2nd, 2012. In that post, Forrest said, "The treasure chest certainly is in the mountains somewhere north of Santa Fe, and that is a clue. That is not to say it is exactly 360 degrees from Santa Fe, but generally. But that statement is useless in modifying Forrest's original statement from The Thrill of the Chase. Since Forrest did not define the term generally, how close to 360 degrees is close enough? Does it have to be within 1 degree, 5 degrees, 10, 20? What's the magic number, and where did that number come from? There is no justification in picking one number over another. Only Forrest knows what he was thinking when he said that. This quote from Forrest cannot be used to reliably alter Forrest's original statement. This position is justified by an additional statement from Forrest. On June 24, 2014, the YouTube channel SBS Dateline published a video about Forrest's treasure hunt. In that video, Forrest was interviewed and asked the following question. One of the things we were talking about this morning was the definition of north of Santa Fe, and that seems to be an issue of contention, but not for you. How would you describe north? Forrest replied, "Well, I'm going to look it up and find out for sure, but north, a northerly direction, to me means anything north of 270 degrees and north of 090 degrees. The interviewer continued, "So, anything above Santa Fe?" Forrest continued, 271 degrees to me can be a northerly direction. So there you have it. With that quote, Forrest gives a definitive answer to his north of Santa Fe statements. In previous videos, I talked about the problem with picking and choosing which hints to use and which hints to ignore based on which hints happen to fit a particular solution. This is no different. There is no justification for choosing to believe one statement by Forrest and choosing to ignore a different statement by Forrest on the same subject. This is especially true when the statement being ignored came later and might be a clarification. But even without the clarification by Forrest, there is still no justification for assigning an arbitrary limit off of 360 degrees. Forrest did not do that. Why would I? For my north of Santa Fe constant, I used the definition that Forrest gave in the SBS Dateline interview. I was using that definition before I saw that interview, but Forrest was kind enough to provide clarification. An example of something that did not make it onto my list of constants was Forrest's statements regarding Toledo. From the Huffington Post on August 23, 2011, Forrest stated, "I'll tell you what I told a woman from Nevada who called and said she knew where the treasure was, but was incapacitated, so would I please get it for her?" I said, "Well, you tell me where it is, and I'll bring it to you." The woman wanted an additional clue, so I told her it's more than 300 miles southwest of Toledo. There are so many problems with this statement that I never seriously considered it to be useful. The problems seem obvious to me, but maybe not to others, so I'll go over some of them here. First, here's a line indicating southwest from Toledo, Ohio. Those who insist that Forrest's north of Santa Fe statement meant within a few degrees of 360 degrees due north of Santa Fe have a problem with this line. If you apply the same rule to southwest of Toledo as was applied to north of Santa Fe, it would mean that the treasure wasn't in the Rocky Mountains or any of the 4 search states. The only way to keep the 360 degrees due north of Santa Fe definition is to apply a different rule to the Toledo statement. And in that case, you're simply making things up to fit whatever solution you have in mind. I prefer to apply the same rule across the board, and applying the same rule I applied to north of Santa Fe to southwest of Toledo yields the following line. Anything south of that east-west line would be southwest of Toledo, Ohio. But in order to accept that definition of southwest of Toledo, you have to apply the same rule to north of Santa Fe. You can't mix and match your definitions and expect people to take you seriously. Or are we just going to play Calvin ball with the rules? But it turns out that none of that matters. Forrest made multiple statements regarding Toledo. The particular statement I have been talking about says southwest of Toledo. In every other instance I found, Forrest says west of Toledo, not southwest. These include an interview with Douglas Preston and Michael McGarity from February 2011, an interview with Lorraine Mills in May of 2011, a post on DaleNeitzel.com from October 2nd, 2012, an interview with SantaFe.com in April of 2013, an interview on the EIS radio show in August of 2013, an interview on the Richard Eads show in May of 2015, and another interview on the Richard Eads show in September of 2015. And in one of those instances, Forrest said more than 400 miles west of Toledo, not 300 miles. Finally, on July 12, 2017, Forrest was asked about his Toledo statement in an article in the Daily Beast. Forrest's reply was that his statement was said in jest, and there was no clue there. But none of that matters either. Forrest's words were southwest of Toledo. Forrest's words were not southwest of Toledo, Ohio. In the United States, there are Toledos in Georgia, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Ohio, Oregon, Washington, and Texas. According to ToledoBlade.com, there were once upwards of 20 towns named Toledo in the United States, including a former Toledo in South Dakota. Outside the United States, there are Toledos in Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, the Philippines, Spain, and Uruguay. Forrest never specified which Toledo he was talking about, so I assume he was talking about Toledo, Ohio. You cannot simply choose Toledo, Ohio, or any of the other Toledos just because it happens to fit your solution best. Doing so casts doubt on everything else you say. So what's the answer? There is a single instance where Forrest said southwest of Toledo. There are multiple instances where Forrest said west of Toledo. Forrest said both 300 miles west of Toledo and 400 miles west of Toledo. Forrest never specifies which Toledo he was talking about, and Forrest specifically says that the statement was made in jest. For me and my search, the Toledo statement is a mess. There is nothing to grab onto. I can manipulate Forrest's Toledo statements to mean whatever I want them to mean. I do not see the Toledo statements as being helpful in the slightest. Toledo did not make it onto my list of constants. Toledo didn't even make it onto my list of hints. The constants did not affect where the poem led me, but they did affect where I started from. All potential solutions were immediately measured against a constant that said that the first two clues had to be obvious. If the first two clues were not obvious, I did not proceed any further with that solution. I set it aside and moved on. For the most part, I let the poem lead me wherever it wanted. Most of the constants are about the final resting place of the treasure, not about the path to get there. If the path dipped below 5,000 feet for a while, that was fine, as long as it ended above 5,000 feet. Some may ask, what about needing only the poem and a map and nothing else? How do the constants fit in with that? The use of constants does not conflict with that statement. In fact, the statement about only needing the poem and a map is, in itself, a constant, which meant that after my solution was complete, I would have to test the solution against that statement. If it turned out that the solution required anything more than the poem and a map, the solution was, in my mind, probably incorrect. At a minimum, it was incomplete. The constant which said that the first two clues must be obvious was not required to solve the poem. That is, one could come up with a solution to the poem without that constant. It would just take longer. However, the constants were required to confirm the solution. The constants were the thing that gave life to a solution. A solution that required the thrill of the chase and was underwater in a mine in Utah and at 3,000 feet elevation was DOA. There was no reason to consider that solution. A solution that satisfied the constants, however, a solution that satisfied every constant, that is what I was looking for. Thank you for watching.